heard properly, I'll indicate.
Try my utmost.
Good. Thank you. Will you state your name?
Lenox Ron Odell Shuman.
And will you spell your middle names for us?
RON O apostrophe capital D
Slowly.
L L
R-O-A,
RON
R-O-N,
then O apostrophe capital D E L L.
Odell. Okay. And what position do you currently hold?
I am the Deputy Speaker of Parliament.
And the address of Parliament is Parliament Building, Public Building, Georgetown, Guyana.
That is correct.
And Mrs. Shuman, you gave a statement in this matter,
I did.
and did you sign that statement?
I did.
And did you initial it?
I initialed each page of everything that I confirmed.
I'm going to ask that you be shown this statement, and please indicate to the commissioners if you are able to identify your signature and your initials.
This is the statement that I initialed and signed, correct.
Thank you. I'm asking that this be admitted as LS1. I have 3 copies for the commissioners. Now, sir, do you recall the March 2020 general elections in Guyana?
I do.
And at that time, were you a candidate for any party?
At that time, I was the leader and presidential candidate for the Liberty and Justice Party.
And is that commonly referred to as the LJP?
That is correct.
Before you entered politics, what did you do?
Before I entered politics, I was an airline pilot. Then I was the chief of my community. I was the vice chairman of the National Two Shows Council.
Do you recall the 3rd of March 2020?
I do.
By this time, had the polls for the general election closed?
That's correct. The polls were closed.
And about 2:30 on that day, did you receive a telephone call?
I did. I received a telephone call from our chief counting agent, Mr. Davon Van Veen.
And as a result, did you do anything or go anywhere?
As a result of that phone call, I awaited a ride from my hotel room to go down to the tabulation center for Region 4, Ashman's building, so-called Ashman's building.
Can you recall at about what time you got there?
I arrived at around 4:30 via the, if you're acquainted with the environment, on Hatfield Street.
And when you arrived at the building, were there police officers there?
When we arrived, we didn't really get to the building. We got to a series of barricades guarded by police officers. So we had to navigate through the police officers to get to the building.
Did you have identification with you as leader of the LJP?
I did.
And was that authorization from GCOM to allow you to enter Ashman's building?
It was for all of the presidential candidates to be permitted into tabulation centers and so on and so forth.
Sure. Well, how long, after your arrival, about how long did it take you to actually access the building?
I would say just over 5 minutes. When we got to the barricade on Hatfield Street, we were initially denied entry into the area, cordoned off by some barricades by the police officers. They subsequently sought permission to be able to permit me into the area. After they received that permission, I was allowed to go to the door, at which point I met some other security officers.
Sure.
Did you present your identification to the police officers when you arrived?
I did, Your Honor.
And what was the response?
The response, the police officers were well acquainted with who I was.
No.
And
No,
they're,
no.
One moment. I don't think you can say they were acquainted with you. The question is, you presented your identification to the police. What was the response, if any, from the police?
So I qualify my statement, Your Honor. The reason I said that is because they called my name before I even showed my identification. So I would assume that there was some sense of acquaintance there.
But no, what I'd like to know is when you showed the ID, did they let you through or did they deny you entry?
They did not.
They denied you entry.
When I got to the barricade, they did not. Are you asking about the barricade or the building?
No, barricade.
No, they did not.
Thank you.
Did you recognize any of the police officers there at the barricade?
No, ma'am.
And were they in uniform?
Yes, they were.
Did they give you a reason for refusing you entry?
They did not.
Now, you said that when you got to the building, there was another set of security. Are you talking about security by police officers?
There was private security presence. There was also a scanner at the door.
Sure.
And
Pause, please. When you say private security presence, were the private security officers wearing a uniform or something which showed which company they worked
yes,
for?
they were. I'm well acquainted with the company that was present there.
What's the name of the company?
RK Security. RK Security.
Right. So, apart from RK Security at the entrance to the building and the scanner, did you observe whether there were police officers there as well?
Yes, ma'am. There was a heavy police presence at the building.
When you entered the building, did you go to the tabulation room?
When I got to the building, I was further asked for my identification.
Yes.
And after some confirmation, they had called another security officer who had to give permission for me to enter. The person that they called, I can't say that I recall his name.
Sure. So they called someone else to get confirmation that you can enter. And having entered the building, did you go to the tabulation room?
I did.
Were there other members from your party there?
There were two other members from my party there, Mr. Davon Van Veen and Mr. Andrew Ramcharan.
And were they also accredited party agents for the LJP?
Yes, they were.
Did you speak with them?
I did have a discussion with them subsequent to the phone call that I received.
Right. And when you got to the tabulation room, can you tell me whether there was any verification process going on at that point.
When we got to the tabulation room,
Only speak for yourself unless you say who you were accompanied with, okay?
when you ask about verification, could you clarify that statement?
Okay, so in the tabulation room, are you familiar with the process which was supposed to be taking place there?
I am.
Okay. And are you familiar with the term verification?
I'm
Counting you prefer?
tabulation, counting.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's walk back a bit. You're familiar with statements of polls?
Correct.
Because is it correct to say that the LJP would have received statements of polls for the regions in which they had contested?
We would have been in possession of some, not
Right.
all.
And what was going on, or what was intended to happen in that tabulation room, was a comparison of your party's statement of polls with GCOM's statement of polls, correct?
Once again, the comparison component is a bit vague. I would say more of a tabulation to ensure that what is being tabulated corresponded to what we had on the SOPs that our agents furnished us.
Right, so you prefer to call it tabulation?
Yes.
Okay, sure. When you got into that room, were GCOM employees engaged in any process of comparison, verification, or tabulation?
No, ma'am.
Did you see any GCOM employees in that room?
I did. There were several GCOM employees.
Did you recognize any of them?
Recognize, could you clarify that statement?
Had you known the chief election officer, for example,
Yes.
before that day?
The chief elections officer, I recognize. I was familiar with him.
What was his name? What's his name? Or
Keith-
what was his name?
Mr. Keith Lowenfield.
And when you saw him, did you speak with him?
When I saw Mr. Lowenfield, he was engaged in a discussion with other party representatives. When he was done with that, I had approached him, introduced myself as the leader of the Liberty and Justice Party.
And at that point, did Mr. Lowenfield say anything to you?
At that point, he had indicated that the tabulation process had paused because the GCOM staff were a bit exhausted and tired. And I inquired as to why, to a certain extent. And he said that they had been there all night going through the tabulation. One of them was pregnant and they wanted to take a break. In fact, if I recall correctly, they wanted to stop the tabulation for the night and resume the next day, the following day.
Well, when you heard the expression of those things by the CEO, what was your response, if any?
Well, I was appalled because I know that ample funds were allocated to the Gang Elections Commission to undertake such an important task. It was, at least in my humble view, it was very, very critical to the preservation of democracy in the country, and it was very important that we concluded the process. So I was appalled that GCOM did not put the kind of mechanisms in place to address or to maybe shift staff as needed to go through a complete process.
And did you express your point of view to Mr. Lowenfield?
Absolutely. Myself and several of my colleagues, when I say colleagues, I'd say other political representatives, expressed the same discontent.
And what was his reply to that?
He did not respond.
Okay. Did he remain in the room?
To my recollection, Mr. Lowenfield listened to us for a little bit. Then he eventually said that the tabulation will continue at some point. Then he went he went outside of the room. I don't know what happened, but I know that 2 staff came back into the room and started to go through some SOPs. Pretty much the tabulation process would have resumed at that point.
Okay, just a second. So we are talking about the tabulation room, and just so that the record could be clear, this is inside Ashman's building.
That's correct.
So in the tabulation room, can you tell us who were the people inside there?
Inside the tabulation room, on one side, if I were to walk into the room on the right-hand side, you had all of the party agents and the observers. You had party representatives. At the front of the room, there was a desk, a stack of SOPs, a computer projector, a projector screen, and on the far back wall, there were several black plastic bags, supposedly garbage bags, or at least what we would use as garbage bags, and you could clearly see some GCOM identification on them.
When you say GCOM identification, what exactly do you mean?
Type lettering on some of the documents spilling out of the bags.
Sure. So you say that after Mr. Lowenfield left the room, 2 GCOM staff entered. Could you tell me how much time passed between his departure from the room and the entry of these 2 people into the room?
I cannot say. I did not have a watch.
And when the 2 people who entered, were they male, female, were they the same people as before?
That's correct. They were the 2 female that I had seen earlier.
Yes. And what happened when they entered?
When they entered, they restarted the exercise of tabulation. I would say that they would not have called out more than 10 SOPs before they started to complain that they're tired again.
Tired again?
Well, initially they had said that they were tired, and Mr. Lowenfield had conveyed to us that they complained about being tired. So after they came back in the room, they called no more than 10 SOPs and said, well, we're tired.
And did they say that to you and other party agents there?
They didn't utter it out loud, but I would have been within the vicinity because I came in late. I sat very close to the front of the tabulation room.
Yes. So you heard what the employees were saying to each other?
I didn't get everything that they were saying, but I heard some utterings of the sort.
Mr. Shuman, roughly how long does it take to read out a statement of vote? What would you say, more or less?
Your Honor, during election, this was my first engagement in the political process. I never witnessed it historically, but I would say when we were at Ashman's building, the time ranged from a few seconds to maybe a minute and a half, maybe more.
To read out all the numbers of the votes that each of the parties received, up to a minute or so.
In some cases it took a bit longer, and in others it was very compressed, based on the events and I would say the activities that ensued.
Right. So can you, sorry?
The numbers are recorded in these boxes.
Yes, sir.
So the GCOM officer would say Anu 210, Apnu 6015, CG 22.
That's correct.
That's the way it went.
That's correct. And in,
So, 2, 4, 6, 8. I could understand a minute.
in some instances, Your Honor, it is my, at least being present, it was clear that in some instances they miscalled numbers. When the chief elections officer came back in, we had complained about some numbers not correlating. And he attributed that to the staff being tired. Yes.
Yes.
State of tiredness, the chief elections officer said, was responsible for inaccurate numbers being called out.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. One more.
Sorry.
Good.
Now, Commissioner Smith asked you about how long it would take to read out a statement of polls, and you said that it would depend on this statement and whether, I take it from my understanding of what you said, whether there were any queries about the numbers, correct?
Correct.
So what I want you to do, if it is at all possible, can you give us an estimate of how long it took the GCOM staff to call out the numbers on these 10 statements of polls to which you have referred? Before they said they were tired again.
Were I to do that, it would be a misrepresentation because, for one, I did not have a watch, so it would just be a guess at this point.
Sure, certainly.
I would say for the 10 SOPs, it would not have taken more than 15 minutes.
Okay. Now, after coming back in and working for about 15 minutes, what did the GCOM employees do?
After they came back and called the SOPs, when the CEO was called back to the room, we complained about the inaccuracies.
Okay,
As-
now, we are trying to avoid the use of we.
Oh,
You have to clarify what your observations were, what you did, what you said, that kind of thing.
Okay.
All right?
there was a complaint about the inaccuracies, several complaints,
By whom?
by myself and other party agents or agents of other parties
And to whom did you complain?
to the chief elections officer, to which he preferred the earlier statement about attributing the discrepancies to the staff being tired.
And what was your response to this?
I was appalled once again that given the kind of resources at GCOM's disposal, that did not put the appropriate mechanisms in place to ensure that this exercise concluded in a timely manner.
Did you again express your party's position to any GCOM staff, whether it's CEO or any other member of staff?
It was an ongoing discussion, the very same ongoing discontent.
I understand, but at that point, where we have 10 statements of polls called and employees talking about tiredness and so on, you have a particular position which your party holds, correct? From what
Correct.
you've just said? So, was the CEO in the room at that time?
Yes, he was.
And did you express your party's position to him?
Absolutely.
And can you recall, in essence, I'm not asking you to give us verbatim because this is from 2020. In essence, what did you say to the CEO at that time?
In essence, what I would have said to the CEO, we are going through a process that is critical to this nation. You have had all of this time to plan an election. It's not something, basically we would have looked from the no confidence motion in 2018 to the date of elections. You're talking close to 18 months, and you have not put the right systems in place to ensure that this process can continue. Given all of the resources and everything, and he simply stood there quietly, no
Okay.
response.
When you spoke to him, was there anyone else around?
There were other parties, agents all around us.
Sure.
Mr. Shuman, I'm a little troubled by your evidence, by which you tell us that you, as a political party representative in the position of presidential candidate, you were making representation, complaint, observations to the chief elections officer, who had primary responsibility for the conduct of the elections. And you were saying to him that this process is not going smoothly. You've had enough time to plan, and you're essentially saying this is inefficiency at work.
Yes, Your Honor.
And he made no response to you? In
From-
light of all that you were saying, he walked away?
In light of all that we said, there were several instances where the CEO, not having a response to any of the queries, just down his head and listened quietly. I cannot speak to the motives behind that, but I can say that there were several engagements with the CEO where he simply came in, sat there as though he's in profound thought, and did absolutely nothing, did not utter a word. And there are also instances that I recall where, having had a boisterous crowd and maybe some other parties with a lot more political force behind them, they would engage the CEO, and it would start to elevate. I was not in that position as a newcomer.
Thank you.
Now, you told us that the CEO didn't respond when you expressed your discontent at this point. Did he remain in that tabulation room?
The CEO, after all of the discussion, when I say discussion, all of the parties protesting, the CEO had initially said, well, because they're tired, we're going to have to continue tomorrow. So everyone protested. In the room there was another gentleman, and there were also other deputy returning officers for the region.
When you
So-
say another, pause please, when you say in the room there was another gentleman, do you mean a GCOM employee?
That's correct. A GCOM employee, tall, Afro descent, braided hair, probably about 6 feet.
And was he the only other GCOM employee there that you could see?
No. There was the gentleman at the front, and like I said, there were also other GCOM deputy returning officers that identified themselves, had valid identification. So,
Identified themselves as
GCOM employees with valid identification.
And how did you know they were deputy returning officers?
They had said that they just concluded their work and they were there to support the process if needed.
I see. I take it at some point Mr. Lowenfield left the room,
At some point he did, that's correct.
and after he left, did you speak to anyone?
After Mr. Lowenfield left, a few other party colleagues, we started to converse.
Sure. And I forgot to ask you this. Apart from party agents in the tabulation room, did you see any observers there?
There were several missions that were present.
And can you remember any particular observer groups that you may have noticed?
I would have seen the OAS rep, Carter Center. I remember seeing the CIOG, AmCham, Private Sector Commission.
Sure. And by OAS, you mean Organization of American States?
That's correct.
So after you started speaking to other party reps and so on, did you make any suggestion to
Absolutely.
your fellow representatives?
Absolutely. My concern at that point was that whatever commotion happened in and about the environment, that it is important that we safeguard the materials in the room. So I had conversed with a couple other party representatives that whatever happened, we need to ensure that the documents in the back and the SOPs were not touched by anyone.
And did the persons to whom you spoke agree with you?
Yes, they did.
So what happened? What did you all do?
We took turn in standing, what I would say, standing guard to the documents and ensuring that no one would come in and interfere with the documents.
Sure. Now, during that period of time, did you see the chairperson of GCOM?
Did not.
And did you make a request to see the chairperson?
Several persons made several requests for the chairperson. I had attempted several times on my own.
Well, how did you attempt to make
Via WhatsApp.
such a request?
I also tried calling. I could not get through on the telephone. The WhatsApp messages went unanswered. So after all of that had happened, I don't know who furnished the request or who got in touch with Madam Chair, but to my recollection, she came into the room. There was a complaint that the process was stalled, it is taking too long, and it is important that we conclude the process that night.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. Before you made that attempt to contact the chair, had there been anything like commotions taking place in the tabulation room or around the tabulation room?
In the tabulation room, aside from the protests to I'd say the delay in process, there was constant commotion outside, which is one of the reasons why I asked my colleagues, political colleagues I would say, to ensure that nothing in the room was touched. So there was a commotion outside, followed by another commotion, and I thought that those were just distractions.
Sure. And when the chair came down to the tabulation room, was she accompanied by anyone?
She was accompanied by a heavy security presence. Security, some of them were in plain clothes and some of them were police officers in uniform.
When she came to the room, how far away were you from her?
I would say no more than 6 feet.
And did she say anything?
The chair spoke, a very soft-spoken person. Whatever she would have said, to my ears it was inaudible. I think that the people who may have been closer would be able to better say, and I don't know.
Yes, so you couldn't hear what she said?
I couldn't decipher it clearly.
Can you say about how long she stayed in the room speaking to the persons there?
It would be less than 5 minutes in my humble.
Sure.
Mr. Shuman,
Yes, sir.
when When the chair came to the tabulation room, would you have seen where she came from?
I would not have seen where she came from prior to her entering the room, Your Honor.
And so you can't say where the accompanying police officers, those who accompanied her, where they came from.
No, Your Honor. My attention was focused to, I would say,
Securing.
more to the front of the room and securing the documents.
Yes.
When the chair entered the room through the main doors in Ashman's building, the crowd fell silent. But beyond that, I did not see if she came through the front door or the side door, the escalator, elevator, I did not look in.
If you can you tell us about how many police officers accompanied her down to where you were?
Based on what I would have seen, it would have been very difficult to decipher who accompanied her through her entire journey, but I know that when she got into the room, I would have seen no less than 4 police officers in uniform come into the room. As I said, there were other security officers present, and I know that because of the discussions we would have had with people who were in the discipline services and who were also present.
Thank you.
Now, the tabulation room, or the room which we refer to as a tabulation room at Ashman's building, it's a glass room. Is that not so?
One side of the room is a cement wall as this, the external, and on the internal it's all glass, correct?
Right. So, did the chair come through a door on the side with the glass?
She did, through the main access door.
And when she entered the room, were you able to observe whether there were police officers or security officers outside of that door?
Yes, there were several police officers. The entire building was littered with police presence.
Now, the chair came and you said, she said something, but you couldn't hear because of where you were standing. What happened then?
The chair was also accompanied by the CEO. After the protest, we were informed that the tabulation would resume.
Did the CEO say anything that you heard?
I cannot recall.
No problem. So you got information that the process was going to restart.
Correct.
And did it restart?
The process restarted with, I think earlier I would have informed you that there was a gentleman in the room, about 6 feet tall, braided hair, Afro descent. He restarted the process, I would assume based on CEO's instructions.
And what happened when he restarted?
When he restarted the process, it seemed to be going quite well at the outset. And eventually he got to a point, I can't recall how many SOPs he would have called, but he got to a point where he also said, you know what, he is also feeling tired. Started to make some minor errors in himself.
Let's just go back a bit. When he restarted, was the CEO there?
No, the CEO had said he would retire for the night. If there were any issues for party agents to get in touch with him, we all had his contact information. Everyone, I would say myself and some of the other parties, representatives that were there. We know that because we confirmed that we all had the correct information.
Sure. So the CEO left and the GCOM employee restarted the process, and this process was calling numbers for party agents to compare with their documents, correct?
Correct.
Was this gentleman working by himself?
To my recollection, he was.
There was no other GCOM employee in the room?
There was no other GCOM employee assisting him. There was another GCOM employee in the room. The deputy returning officer from one of the other district that I had indicated
Yes.
showed his identification. He was also there.
So the GCOM employee restarted the process. What happened?
He restarted the process, then he started to call some numbers in error.
And what was the reaction of the party agents there?
We all protested. At that point, we seemed a bit baffled as to someone who looked so energetic earlier, before when all the commotion was happening, all of a sudden started to say, well, I too am tired.
And he complained of tiredness, and I take it there was some sort of commotion.
Absolutely. At every opportunity where there was an error being made, whether in process or in verification, there was always a protest.
Sure. And did this GCOM employee do anything after this commotion arose?
Absolutely. The GCOM employee, he picked up the computer, unplugged the computer, folded it, and walked out of the room.
Which computer was this?
There was a laptop, a black laptop with a specific mark. I can't describe the mark per se, but I know because part of the mark on the computer, it was a brand, and part of that brand was peeled off. So there was a flaw in the
Sure.
branding.
So he unplugged the computer, and what did he do?
He walked out of the room, and if you were acquainted with the Ashman's building, he would have turned left and walked into another room where only GCOM employees were permitted. Wooden door, glass windows on the front, curtains with some small creases where one would be able to peep into the room.
Okay, I just have to get some verification that your audio is being picked up. Yes, thank you. Now, when he left the tabulation room and went to this other room, what did you do?
When he left the tabulation room, myself and the persons who were there to stand, at least we had talked about standing guard, we stood guard. I turned around and followed with my eyes, not physically, because I wanted to ensure everything was safe in the room. When he got, actually before he even took the computer, when he started to unplug the computer, when he said he's going to stop the process, there was a massive protest in the room from all the people that were present, including the observers. And he walked out of the room. He was followed by several other parties, agents.
Did he give anybody an explanation as to why he was removing the computer?
Not to my recollection.
When GCOM employees had left the room before, had they removed the computer?
No.
So you say that he went to another room. At any point, did you go to that other room?
At one point, I heard this massive commotion, people yelling that he is, when I say he, I'm referring to the very same gentleman that took the computer out of the room, that he has the computer open and he is doing something to it. And there was this massive commotion that drew my attention and my presence to go and investigate.
Okay, so when you heard the commotion and the allegations, you were still in the tabulation room?
When I heard the initial commotion, I was in the tabulation room. When it got to the point where someone said he has the computer open and he's doing something, then I ran out of the tabulation
Sure.
room.
Can you recall who said that?
I can, but I also want to ensure that it was a gentleman named Sesnarayan Singh.
Okay, sure. So you ran out of the tabulation room. Where did you go?
I ran to the door of the room in which he was sitting with the computer screen open.
And who is the he?
The gentleman, the GCOM staff that walked out of the room with the computer.
Did you know his name at the time?
At the time I did.
You
I
did?
la-
What's his
yes. I want to, I don't know if I would pronounce it correctly, but Livan or something to that extent.
name? Mr. Livan, did you know his first name?
Enrico Livan.
Okay.
It's foggy.
So let's go with Mr. Livan. So the he to whom you refer.
Enrique, I think it's
Enrique.
Enrique.
Okay. So the he to whom you refer is Mr. Enrique Livan. Yes?
Yes.
So when you went to that other room, did you see Mr. Livan there?
I did. He was seated at the desk with the computer slightly open. I think at that point, when I got there, he had stopped typing, stopped manipulating. When we looked at it, at the computer, when it left the room, there was no USB drive in it. When we got to the room, there was a USB drive inserted in the computer.
Was there any other GCOM employee in that room?
Yes. When you walked into the room on the right-hand side, there was a yoga mat with one GCOM employee lying down in what I would call a resting position. And there was also a GCOM staff standing at a printer that was to the left-hand side as you enter the room. And the printer was in the process of printing something.
And at this point in time, what did you do or say?
With the commotion going on, people were yelling that he is changing the numbers, of which I had no verification. But when I saw the printer still printing documents, I brought it to the attention of everyone in the room. I said, look, they're printing some documents. They're printing something. At that point, when I brought it to the attention of the room, people looked over, and the young lady that was standing right next to the printer went and laid next to the next GCOM staff that was resting. I picked up the stack of papers and I held on to it. I showed it to other people. I said, look at what they're printing.
Okay. And did the GCOM employee say anything
They
or
did
give
not.
any explanation as to what she was printing?
She did not.
Did anyone ask her?
I don't recall anyone asking her.
And what about Mr. Livan? Did anyone there ask him anything?
There were a series of questions being thrown at him. He was being bombarded by questions, but he said absolutely nothing. I think at one point, if I recall correctly, he would have pulled the screen down and just put his hands on the desk and put his head down.
When you say pull the screen down, you mean the
As in-
laptop screen?
As in close the laptop screen down.
And he put his head on the desk?
Yeah.
You took possession of the printed material
Yes,
in the
sir.
room. Did you look at it?
I did.
What was being printed?
I presented some documents to council of what we had asked Mr. Lowenfield for. The documents would resemble the very same set.
So
With the same-
you kept those documents
I held on to it
and kept it.
for a short while. I did not keep it in my possession.
What did you do with it?
At one point, after we started all of this, there was call for CID to come and investigate. When, at the time, Commander Thomas brought his ranks in, I brought it to their attention because he had said, well, we are going to have to investigate this. So I said, look, these documents came off the printer, they're still warm. This is what they're printing, and I think this would be beneficial to your investigation. One of the police officers took it from me. I did not get his name, rank, nor ID number.
In the presence of Commander Thomas?
In the presence of everyone that was there.
Thank you.
Now, so if you see a copy of those documents that you handed to to one of the police officers who came to Ashman's building with Commander Thomas, will you be able to identify it?
I think to a great extent I would.
Yes. Did you initial your copy?
I did.
And will you be able to identify it by your initial?
I would be able to identify a copy of a document that was furnished to us by Mr. Lowenfield.
And this,
Not the documents that I got off the printer.
I see. Okay. So you handed over those documents. Can you remember the name of the officer to whom you gave those
I
documents?
cannot.
And did that officer ever contact you afterwards for a statement in relation to those documents?
No, ma'am, he did not.
When you saw Assistant Commissioner of Police Thomas, where was he?
Commander Thomas, when he walked into the room, he went, where he was positioned was to the back right of the CHICOM officer, Mr. Livan, and that was close to an exit door to the back of the room. He was facing the crowd.
And were you still in that? Where were you in the room? Were you
I was
closer to the
standing-
printer?
I was standing just, I'd say, adjacent to the printer and maybe 4 feet away from Commander Thomas.
And well, tell us very briefly what happened when the police arrived.
Well, before
Sorry, I
you
beg your
before
pardon.
you answer that, can I ask you? You said that Mr. Livan said he was tired,
Yes, sir.
and then he took this laptop into the room. Now, this is a sample of one of the documents that you retrieved.
No, Your Honor, that is a document that after there was this boisterous complaint and Mr. Thomas and everyone else came into the room with the investigative team, there were several calls to the chief elections officer that something is fishy, something seems to be afoot, and we summoned him back to Ashman's building. When he came back to Ashman's building, there was this complaint about the conduct of one of his officers. And there was a call for us to see exactly what was being done to the data. Of course, when Mr. Thomas was in there, he wanted to take the computer and the USB to conduct his investigation. We protested against that. When Mr. Lowenfield returned, we all went back into the tabulation room, and we demanded to see what was on the computer, what was on the disk. When the computer was opened, it was plugged in, we saw several files on the desktop displayed on the screen. And we started to point out which file it is that we were working with in the initial tabulation. Mr. Livan opened one file that was a completely different region. We said, no, it's not that one. It's the next one. So when he clicked on the next icon, what opened up was a pre-populated spreadsheet. Not the one that we were working on when we came in and when we were going through the tabulation process. He clicked on the folder, I would say in error, and this pre-populated spreadsheet came up. and there was this massive uproar in the room that, you know, there seems to be something afoot. After that uproar, that spreadsheet was closed, and the correct one was then open, of which everyone confirmed. We went through a series of numbers, and we confirmed that that is the spreadsheet that we were working with. Mr. Lowenfield at that point said, well, our staff is tired. If the gentleman would have done something in error, we are going to have it corrected before we resume. And there were calls for us to have, at least in paper format, the work that we would have completed during the day. When I say we, as in various political parties would have completed, so that we know that when we come back the next day, that we have the baseline information, and all of us are furnished a copy with the same thing, so we could work through and ensure that it correlates to what we actually did, and not something that was pre-populated.
So, in relation to the pre-populated file, nobody asked for that information.
I don't recall that anyone asked specifically for that. I think at that point, my concern, and I can't speak on other people's behalf, is that whatever we would have completed, we want to ensure that that data correlates to our starting point the next day.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Mr. Shuman, the spreadsheet that you say was pre-populated, do you know which polling station it related to?
The pre-populated spreadsheet was from Region 4.
Could it have been a spreadsheet that you had already tabulated?
No, Your Honor.
How do you know?
There were certain information on the spreadsheet that correlated to what we did. It had on it the region. There were several ballots, when I say ballot boxes, with the numerical value that correlates to Region 4.
But there weren't ballots that had already been tabulated.
That's correct, Your Honor. If I were to clarify something, and if I may, Your Honors, just for the purpose
Yes.
of explanation.
If I may just take you to that point, in answer to the Commissioner, you said that you all had requested a hard copy from Mr. Lowenfield,
Yes,
and are these the copies that I have here?
I cannot say, but I know that the copies that I would have given you, I have initialed.
Sure.
Initial.
So I'm going to ask you now to. This one? Yes. Look at this and see if you see your initial.
The initial is cut from the last page, if I may say.
Yes.
So for the first,
Yes.
all but the last
If
page.
I can find one that has been properly copied. I'm afraid I don't do the photocopying, so I apologize to you. Yes, I'm afraid I will have to make fresh copies and have this document shown to you at a later stage.
May I just ask, is it just one page that's not initialed?
Yes, Your Honor.
The others are initialed,
Yes, Your Honor.
and they bear your initials?
Yes, Your Honor.
I'm just asking counsel, are we able to view the ones that have or you'd prefer to have it redone over?
I prefer for it to be done meticulously.
All right. Can I ask what the document is?
The difficulty is I have not yet let him to
I
that
see.
point. So I need to ask him, it would be better for me to ask him a few more questions to clarify what it is,
Sure.
and also to have a proper copy available to be admitted into evidence and for, clear copies to be provided to the commissioners.
Well, let me ask you, I followed him in his answer. He seemed to say that the request was made of the chief elections officer for a record of the verification that had been done up to that point.
Correct.
And this was the result of that request.
Yes.
So all we need to do is to take out the unmarked page, because we're not using this for any specific finding, but it will just be supportive of his evidence that the CEO did produce and meet the request for printed copies of the work done so far.
Indeed, Commissioner, and may your words go to the ears of the photocopiers.
No, I was just thinking that if, rather than bringing the gentleman back, he might be busy, that we put in the pages that he is initially.
No, what I was going to do at this point is to perhaps ask whether you would consider taking your morning break to allow us to do this,
Yes,
so that
okay,
when we
okay.
resume, we can continue.
We take a morning break for 20 minutes.